Worst U.S. defeat of the war, May 1780. The Southern strategy was developed by Lord Germain, based on input from London-based loyalists like Joseph Galloway. Thought it made no sense to fight the Patriots in the north where they were strongest, while the New England economy was reliant on trade with Britain, regardless of who governed it. On the other hand, duties on tobacco made the South far more profitable for Britain, while local support meant securing it required small numbers of regular troops. Victory would leave a truncated United States facing British possessions in the South, Canada to the north and Ohio on their western border, with the Atlantic seaboard controlled by the Royal Navy. Congress would be forced to agree to terms. However, assumptions about the level of loyalist support proved wildly optimistic. 224. Germain accordingly ordered Augustin Prevost, the British commander in East Florida, to advance into Georgia in December 1778. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, an experienced officer taken prisoner in the war before being exchanged for Ethan Allen, captured Savannah on the 29th of December 1778. Recruited a loyalist militia of nearly 1,100, many of whom allegedly joined only after Campbell threatened to confiscate their property. 225. Poor motivation and training made them unreliable troops, as demonstrated in their defeat by Patriot militia at the Battle of Kettle Creek on the 14th of February 1779, although this was offset by British victory at Briar Creek on March 3. 226. In June, Prevost launched an abortive assault on Charleston, before retreating to Savannah, an operation notorious for widespread looting by British troops that enraged both loyalists and patriots. In October, a joint French and American operation under Admiral d'Estaing and General Benjamin Lincoln failed to capture Savannah. 227. Prevost was replaced by Lord Cornwallis, who assumed responsibility for Germain's strategy. He soon realized estimates of loyalist support were considerably overstated, and needed far larger numbers of regular forces. 228. A close-up of a cavalry melee on large horses with sabers and pistols drawn. 3 redcoats center-right are engaging 2 patriots in blue, along with an African-American in a brown linen shirt and white pants, with his pistol drawn and leveled at a redcoat. American and British cavalry clash. U.S. routes British Legion Battle of Cowpens, January 1781. Reinforced by Clinton, his troops captured Charleston in May 1780, inflicting the most serious Patriot defeat of the war. Over 5,000 prisoners were taken and the Continental Army in the South effectively destroyed. On the 29th of May, Loyalist regular Banastra Tarleton defeated an American force of 400 at the Battle of Waxhaws. Over 120 were killed, many allegedly after surrendering. Responsibility is disputed, Loyalists claiming Tarleton was shot at while negotiating terms of surrender, but it was later used as a recruiting tool by the Patriots. 229. Clinton returned to New York, leaving Cornwallis to oversee the South. Despite their success, the 2 men left barely on speaking terms, with dire consequences for the future conduct of the 230. The Southern strategy depended on local support, but this was undermined by a series of coercive measures. Previously, captured patriots were sent home after swearing not to take up arms against the king. They were now required to fight their former comrades, while confiscation of patriot-owned plantations led formerly neutral grandees to side with them. 231. Skirmishes at Williamson's Plantation, Cedar Springs, Rocky Mount, and Hanging Rock signaled widespread resistance to the new oaths throughout South Carolina. 232. In July, Congress appointed General Horatio Gates commander in the South. He was defeated at the Battle of Camden on the 16th of August, leaving Cornwallis free to enter North Carolina. 233. Despite battlefield success, the British could not control the countryside and Patriot attacks continued. Before moving north, Cornwallis sent Loyalist militia under Major Patrick Ferguson to cover his left flank, leaving their forces too far apart to provide mutual support. 234. In early October, Ferguson was defeated at the Battle of Kings Mountain, dispersing organized Loyalist resistance in the region. 235. Despite this, Cornwallis continued into North Carolina hoping for Loyalist support, while Washington replaced Gates with General Nathanael Greene in December 1780. 236. Greene divided his army, leading his main force southeast pursued by Cornwallis. A detachment was sent southwest under Daniel Morgan, who defeated Tarleton's British Legion at Cowpens on the 17th of January, 1781, nearly eliminating it as a fighting force. 237. The Patriots now held the initiative in the South, with the exception of a raid on Richmond led by Benedict Arnold in January 1781. 238. Greene led Cornwallis on a series of countermarches around North Carolina. By early March, the British were exhausted and short of supplies, and Greene felt strong enough to fight the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on the 15th of March. Although victorious, Cornwallis suffered heavy casualties and retreated to Wilmington, North Carolina, seeking supplies and reinforcements. 239. Left foreground, curving into the center, double line of Continental infantry, braced with their muskets and bayonets held at the ready. In the left background, U.S. cavalry is charging towards lines of British infantry. In the right background, immediately behind the U.S. infantry, is the occasional sergeant in formation. Behind the line are two mounted U.S. officers under a winter tree. 1st Maryland Regiment in line, Guilford Courthouse, March 1781. The Patriots now controlled most of the Carolinas and Georgia outside the coastal areas. After a minor reversal at the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, they recaptured Fort Watson and Fort Mott on April 15. 240. On June 6, Brigadier General Andrew Pickens captured Augusta, leaving the British in Georgia confined to Charleston and Savannah. 241. The Assumption Loyalists with the most of the fighting left the British short of troops, and battlefield victories came at the cost of losses they could not replace. Despite halting Greene's advance at the Battle of Eutaw Springs on September 8, Cornwallis withdrew to Charleston with little to show for his campaign. 242. Western Campaign. When Spain joined France's war against Britain in 1779, their treaty specifically excluded Spanish military action in North America. However, from the beginning of the war, Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, allowed the Americans to import supplies and munitions into New Orleans, then ship them to Pittsburgh. 243. This provided an alternative transportation route for the Continental Army bypassing the British blockade of the Atlantic coast. 244. The trade was organized by Oliver Pollock, a successful merchant in Havana and New Orleans who was appointed U.S. commercial agent. 245. It also helped support the American campaign in the West. In the 1778 Illinois campaign, militia under General George Rogers Clark cleared the British from what was then part of Quebec, creating Illinois County, Virginia. 246. Despite official neutrality, Guelphs initiated offensive operations against British outposts. 247. First, he cleared British garrisons in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Fort Butte, and Natchez, Mississippi, and captured 5 forts. 248. In doing so, Guelphs opened navigation on the Mississippi River north to the American settlement in Pittsburgh. 249. In 1781, Guelphs and Pollock campaigned east along the Gulf Coast to secure West Florida, including British-held Mobile and Pensacola. 250. The Spanish operations impaired the British supply of armaments to British Indian allies, which effectively suspended a military alliance to attack settlers between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. 251. AC. British defeat in the United States. 2 lines of warships at sea sailing with full sails downwind away from the viewer and firing broadsides at one another, in the center foreground receding into the left background. 6 of the French fleet, in the right foreground receding to the center 4 of the British fleet. French fleet, L, engages the British. French transports land supplies behind Battle of the Chesapeake. Seat 1781. Clinton spent most of 1781 based in New York City. He failed to construct a coherent operational strategy, partly due to his difficult relationship with Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot. 252. In Charleston, Cornwallis independently developed an aggressive plan for a campaign in Virginia, which he hoped would isolate Greene's army in the Carolinas and cause the collapse of Patriot assistance in the South. This was approved by Lord Germain in London, but neither of them informed Clinton. 253. Washington and Rochambeau now discussed their options. The former wanted to attack New York, the latter Virginia, where Cornwallis forces were less well established and thus easier to defeat. 254. Washington eventually gave way and Lafayette took a combined Franco-American force into Virginia. 255. But Clinton misinterpreted his movements as preparations for an attack on New York. Concerned by this threat, he instructed Cornwallis to establish a fortified sea base where the Royal Navy could evacuate his troops to help defend New York. 256. When Lafayette entered Virginia, Cornwallis complied with Clinton's orders and withdrew to Yorktown, where he constructed strong defenses and awaited evacuation. 257. An agreement by the Spanish Navy to defend the French West Indies allowed Admiral de Grasse to relocate to the Atlantic seaboard, a move Arbuthnot did not anticipate. 252. This provided Lafayette naval support, while the failure of previous combined operations at Newport and Savannah meant their coordination was planned more carefully. 258. Despite repeated urging from his subordinates, Cornwallis made no attempt to engage Lafayette before he could establish siege lines. 259. Even worse, expecting to be withdrawn within a few days, he abandoned outer defenses, which were promptly occupied by the besiegers and hastened British defeat. 260. Center foregrounder. British officer on the left standing surrenders to a mounted Continental officer, far left foreground receding into the center background. A British line of infantry then mounted cavalry, with a large white flag of surrender, far right foreground receding into the center background. A Continental line of infantry, then mounted cavalry, with a large U.S. flag of the army. Cornwallis surrenders. Yorktown, October 1781. His army sails to NYC. Clinton replaced. Parliament ends offensive action in N. On the 31st of August, a British fleet under Thomas Graves left New York for Yorktown. 261, after landing troops and munitions for the besiegers on the 30th of August. De Grasse had remained in Chesapeake Bay and intercepted him on September 5, although the Battle of the Chesapeake was indecisive in terms of losses. Graves was forced to retreat, leaving Cornwallis isolated. 262, an attempted breakout over the York River at Gloucester Point failed due to bad weather. 263, under heavy bombardment with dwindling supplies, Cornwallis felt his situation was hopeless and on October 16 sent emissaries to Washington to negotiate a surrender. After 12 hours of negotiations, these were finalized the next day. 264, responsibility for defeat was the subject of fierce public debate between Cornwallis, Clinton and Germain. Despite criticism from his junior officers, Cornwallis retained the confidence of his peers and later held a series of senior government positions. Clinton ultimately took most of the blame and spent the rest of his life in obscurity. 265, subsequent to Yorktown, American forces were assigned to supervise the armistice between Washington and Clinton made to facilitate British departure following the January 1782 law of Parliament forbidding any further British offensive action in North America. British-American negotiations in Paris led to preliminaries signed November 1782 acknowledging U.S. independence. The enacted congressional law aimed for British withdrawal from its North American claims to be ceded to the U.S. was completed for the coastal cities in stages. 266, in the South, Generals Greene and Wayne loosely invested the withdrawing British at Savannah and Charleston. There they observed the British finally taking off their regulars from Charleston December 14, 1782. 267, Loyalist provincial militias of whites and free blacks, as well as Loyalists with their slaves were transported in a relocation to Nova Scotia and the British Caribbean. Add, Native American allies of the British and some freed blacks were left to escape through the American lines unaided. Washington moved his army to New Windsor on the Hudson River about 60 miles north of New York City. 268. And there the substance of the American army was furloughed home with officers at half pay until the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war on the 3rd of September, 1783. At that time, Congress decommissioned regiments of Washington's Continental Army and began issuing land grants to veterans in the Northwest Territories for their war service. The last of the British occupation of New York City ended on November 25. 1783, with the departure of Clinton's replacement, General Sir Guy Carleton. 269. Strategy and Commanders. West Point Military Academy Map of America east of the Mississippi River. Campaigns noted in New England, in the Middle Colonies with 3 British, Red sailing ship, naval victories, in the South with 2 British naval victories, and in Virginia with 1 French, Blue sailing ship, naval victory. A timeline bar graph below shows almost all British, red bar, victories on the left in the first half of the war, and almost all US, blue bar, victories on the right in the second half of the war. American Revolution Principal Campaigns. 270, British Movement, red, and American, blue. The timeline shows British won most battles in the first half, Americans won most in the second. To win their insurrection, the Americans needed to outlast the British will to continue the fight. To restore the empire, the British had to defeat the Continental Army in 30 months, and compel the Congress to dissolve itself. 271, historian Terry M. Mays identifies 3 separate types of warfare, the first being a colonial conflict in which objections to imperial trade regulation were as significant as taxation policy. The second was a civil war with all 13 states split between patriots, loyalists and those who preferred to remain neutral. Particularly in the South, many battles were fought between patriots and loyalists with no British involvement, leading to divisions that continued after